Well, hey there, and welcome to Unmistakably You. If you are joining us for the kind of second time tonight, my apologies for the technical difficulties, but welcome. I'm Amy from Unmistakably You. I'm a wedding planner and an educator here in London, Ontario, and I am here to help you with all of the questions that you have related to your wedding. So if you're tuning in for the first time, we go live here every Wednesday at 8 p.m. to talk about the things that you might be dealing with in your wedding planning and to help you to navigate all of those questions that you might have. So as always, whether you're joining for the first time or whether you've been with us for a while, I encourage you to post your comments and thoughts and questions in the chat. I am more than happy to answer questions live or to come back to them if you're catching us on the replay. If you would rather reach out to me, Amy at unmistakably.you.com, I'm always around to chat about all things weddings. It's my jam. So welcome to the third in our series for this March about seasonal weddings. So tonight we are here to talk about what to think about if you're planning a summer wedding. And here in Southern Ontario, summer is a lot of people's goal to get married when the weather is hopefully nice and warm and sunny and you have optimal temperatures, and it's definitely a very popular season. So when we're talking about summer, I mean, as you know, the weather in Ontario can be fickle. So we're basically talking about sort of beginning of June until end of summer, with the understanding that at the outsides of that range, things can be a little bit dicey. You may have cooler temperatures, maybe more bugs at the beginning of June as things get a little bit darker. You may have more tendency towards rainstorms at the end of September. But again, things could be beautiful at either end of that spectrum. And you could absolutely have a really, really cold day in August, or you could have a thunderstorm in July. So just be mindful as you are planning for really any season in Southern Ontario that your backup plan is your best friend. And so we've talked about that with regard to winter weddings and with regard to spring weddings, and now with regard to summer weddings as well. We always encourage you to have a really strong backup plan that you feel comfortable with, that you're okay reverting to. If your backup plan is like a disaster that you hate thinking about, that you don't even want to consider that being your wedding, maybe try to find a different plan and be okay with it, because you don't want that to ruin your wedding day. Ultimately, your wedding day hopefully is about the commitment that you're making to your partner. And if you have to pivot because of the weather, hopefully it's pivoting to a situation that you are also okay with. Obviously, it's not the first choice, but having a strong, solid backup plan is really honestly going to save your sanity. And I would always encourage, regardless of season, that you have conversations with the people who will be implementing that plan around when does it get put into place? When do we make that call? What's the latest? What's the drop dead time that we could still make an outdoor ceremony happen if we're going that route? Who's going to make the call? Does that give enough time for the people who are setting up chairs to get it done? How is that going to be communicated if you have a dramatically different location? Like if you were planning on getting married outdoor at a private property and then the weather is bad and you have to move to a church down the road, how does that get communicated to your guests? So making sure that you have a really solid plan. And I would encourage you, in terms of a summer wedding, to not only consider a rain plan, but also to consider an extreme heat plan, because the reality is that things are unpredictable in our region, and extreme heat is just as much a concern as rain is. So I would encourage you to think about both of those plans and to have someone that you trust in place to put them into action if need be. Things also to think about if you're getting married in the summer are that we tend to have more long weekends in the summer. So that can work to your advantage, or it can actually be detrimental depending on your guest demographic. So you may want to book for instance, a Sunday on a long weekend, because you kind of have that bonus day with the Monday. And if that's going to work for a lot of your guests, that could open up a weekend that otherwise would have been booked where a Saturday maybe wasn't available at your venue. But it can also be a detriment to you if a lot of your guests happen to be, we go camping every May 2/4, or we always rent a cottage on the July long weekend or the Victoria Day. So just be mindful of the fact that long weekends could work to your advantage, but may not. And so thinking about those kinds of things when you're choosing your wedding date are going to serve you well. When you are selecting your venue, we've gone through some winter and spring considerations for venue. When we talk about choosing a venue in the summer, obviously you also want to keep some of those similar things in mind if you tuned in the last couple of weeks. Climate control being probably at front of mind. You likely will want to make sure, if you are getting married, particularly in the dead of summer in July and August here in Ontario, that you have a venue that is air conditioned. You want to make sure that the climate control is there. If you're doing any component of your day outdoors, you'll want to think about whether shade is possible. Having a ceremony in the absolute, hottest part of the day with no shade available is definitely not something that is guest friendly or wedding party friendly. So thinking about maybe visiting your ceremony site the year before at the same date and time as your ceremony, if you have the luxury of that time, or maybe the week or 2 weeks before, when the sun is pretty much doing what it's going to do at the time of your wedding. That may allow you to chase some shadows around and to say, okay, so we thought we were going to orient our ceremony this way, but maybe we'll turn it by 45 degrees so that we can take advantage of the way that the shade is falling from the trees. If there is an outdoor component and you don't have the luxury of shade, you may want to find ways to provide shade. Maybe it's installing sunshades, if that's something that's available, those triangular sun sails that you could put in if that's a possibility at your venue. Maybe you want to invest in some paper parasols for guests who are a little bit more susceptible to the sun. But definitely thinking particularly about your very old, your very young, and any immunocompromised guests and their comfort in extreme heat is going to be something that you'll want to think about. You'll want to think also, if you are having a tented wedding, which is very popular here in Southern Ontario in the summer, about climate control in there. So there are a million things to think about with tent weddings, and we have in the past and will in the future talk all about tented weddings. But with regard to climate control, some things to think about. Is it possible, if it's going to be very hot, to rent fans? There are freestanding fans that oscillate that you can put in the corner. Some tent companies have tent fans that actually attach to the top perimeter rail of the tent. So those are some things to think about. You can actually rent tent air conditioners. What that would mean is that your tent has to be closed up for the duration of the day. And I would just caution you there that if you've created this sort of microclimate within your tent, where it's cold in the tent and really hot outside, that is a really solid recipe for condensation. So just be really mindful that if you've got extreme temperature differences between the inside of a tent and the outside of a tent, you run the risk of it raining inside your tent as a result of the condensation that's created. So just be careful about that. And that same thing actually applies to those beautiful ClearSpan tents. They're lovely. You can see the stars through the ceiling, but they do kind of act like a greenhouse on a hot summer day. So if you're having a tented wedding, be mindful about how you're going to deal with the heat, as well as what happens if you're maybe on the perimeter of those summer months and it gets still quite cool at night. You might want to look into a tent heater, which kind of operates the same way as an air conditioner, in that you will want to have your tent closed up. So you'll need to think about how that works with relationship to the walls. Most tents have walls that kind of clip to a rope on the top of the perimeter. So they're not really quick and easy to put up and take down. So you may need to have someone in charge of, if it's going to get cool at night, putting those tent walls up, maybe turning on a propane tent heater or a gas-powered tent heater, if that's something that you're you're thinking you might need depending on the season of your wedding. In a lot of cases, you're not allowed by tent rental companies to have those patio heaters, the tall ones that have propane in them and that have those shields. In a lot of cases, you're not permitted to have those in your tents. So just be really careful. If you are climate controlling a tent, have a very, very open and honest conversation with your tent company and do a little bit of other research on your own to determine the effects that a tent air conditioner or tent heaters are going to have on your actual tent. Now, thinking about transportation, in the summer, again, if it's hot, you want to make sure that any transportation you're taking is climate controlled, both for you and for your guests. I do a lot of weddings where we actually hire school buses to do transportation of guests, whether it's, one shuttle in the afternoon and a couple of shuttles later in the evening. But be mindful that a lot of school buses don't have air conditioning or don't have reliable air conditioning. So that could make it a very uncomfortable trip for your guests. You may also want to have a conversation with your limo company about that. A lot of limo companies that perhaps are more affordable tend to be more affordable for the reason that their fleet isn't as new or as well maintained. And oftentimes I find that with those really affordable limo companies, they come at a sacrifice, and that often is the air conditioning not working. So double check on that with regard to transportation. And the other thing that kind of has to do sort of peripherally with transportation, but also with guest accommodation, is to consider what else might be happening in your town at the time of your wedding. So perhaps if you're in a small community, there might be a fair that happens on a particular weekend every year. Maybe there's a festival. I'm thinking I'm in London, Ontario, and we have festivals at Victoria Park all the time. And those not only impede the traffic flow in that area. So you would want to account for that in terms of your travel time to and from venues and photos, but also can have an effect on the amount of accommodation that is available. So double check with regard to festivals or sporting events or big conferences. If there is anything like that that happens in your region, you'll want to potentially avoid those weekends for the purposes of transportation and guest accommodation. Now, when you're setting up your schedule for your overall day, I would always advise you, regardless of the season, to work closely with your planner and with your photographer to determine a schedule that works best, obviously for the flow of the day and to make sure that you're feeling relaxed and not rushed, but also a photography schedule, particularly in the heat of summer, that's going to work with the light. So generally speaking, what that means is you'll probably want to avoid the harshest light of the day, which is usually over the noon hour and the first couple of hours of the afternoon. So you may want to think about moving your schedule later, shifting your entire wedding a little bit later in the day to take advantage of potentially cooler afternoon temperatures. And once that sun dips down in the sky, it's going to be less harsh for photos and also less heat for guests who may happen to be outside waiting for a ceremony. You also want to think about the fact that the sun is going to be up later in the day. So when you're accounting for things like golden hour photos or dark sunset photos, you're going to need to move that to be substantially later than it would have been even in early spring. So checking your sunset times is going to be important, and having that conversation with your photographer. If they're providing an 8-hour package and you want them there to capture those really dramatic backlit dark photos, they're going to need to be there past 9 p.m. And if you have an 8-hour package, that means they're not starting until 1. So do you have enough time to capture the before ceremony things that you'd like to capture, as well as having them there long enough to take advantage of the available daylight during that time of year? So definitely talking to your photographer is really important with regard to scheduling all of the things from wedding party photos to first look, if you're doing that, to ceremony, to post-ceremony photos, and even later into the evening, especially if you're hoping to do those sparkler photos or dark photos of any kind. You also want to think about the schedule in terms of daylight where it relates to your dance. If you are having a traditional ceremony, cocktail, dinner, dance kind of a structure to your day, you'll need to think about the time that you start your dance. Generally speaking, people tend to be more comfortable dancing once it's dark outside. And I don't know why that is. It's a psychological thing, maybe, where they feel like it's a little bit more safe once it's a little bit more dim. So if you do have a venue that has natural light coming in, just recognize the fact that it's not going to be dark until after 9 p.m. on those long summer days. So you might want to aim to start the dance portion of your evening around about that time. If you try to start it earlier in the evening, you may find that it's a very slow start to your dance party because guests don't want to dance when they feel exposed in the bright light of the sun. And as someone who is a very self-conscious dancer, I can attest to that. I would definitely feel more inclined to get out on the dance floor if I felt like it was harder to see me, aka darker. So think about that. You will want to give some real thought to both guest and wedding party comfort if you're thinking about a summer wedding. So with regard to your guests, we've already talked about providing shade, creating shade if there isn't any naturally occurring, but also make sure that you have a lot of water available for the duration of the day. I often recommend a water station pre-ceremony. If your ceremony is taking place outside, I would definitely have water available, whether it's bottled or available at the bar during cocktail hour. And then make sure that you have your caterer serving water during dinner. Some caterers don't actually include that. So make sure that's a conversation that you have. Make sure that if you are in a barn or a backyard or somewhere where the water isn't drinkable, that you have supplied bottled water, whether it's those big 4-liter jugs or the large ones that fit on water coolers. You want to make sure that you have lots and lots of water, more than you think you will need, available for your guests. And then make sure that also you have enough ice to cool it down. So generally speaking, I find that people underestimate the amount of ice. We usually recommend, depending on what's being served at your bar, we generally recommend about a ½ pound to a full pound of ice per guest. So making sure that you have somewhere to store that ice that's easily accessible for your bartenders or your wait staff or whoever needs to access it is really, really important. And then also, just when we're talking about providing perhaps bottled water, just a little environmental plug here, make sure that you provide recycling containers. I am always very guilty when it comes to the waste and the lack of environmental protection that I see at weddings. So please make sure that if you are providing that bottled water for your guests, that you provide a recycling container for them to dispose of the empties. There are also, we mentioned tent fans that you could provide if you're having an outdoor wedding in a tent. You might also consider some kind of a misting system, whether that's an actual, like a hose misting system that someone installs for you, or even just having atomizers of water available for your guests and for your wedding party. A little spritz of water can go a long way to cooling you down on a hot day. And that's something that you may want to make available for your wedding party, particularly because they often do end up being outside for prolonged periods of time. When you're doing photos or during the ceremony, they're standing up with you. Heaven forbid one of them should pass out. So please make sure that they are hydrated and that you provide lots of time for them to cool down. If you're doing an outdoor photo session, maybe provide a nice cool place for them to go following the photos before the ceremony to make sure that they have time to cool off appropriately. Definitely think about their attire. If it does tend to be a really, really hot day, maybe you want to plan early and have your bridesmaids or any female members of your wedding party wearing short gowns as opposed to floor length. Maybe you want to give any male members of your party the option to wear no jackets or no vests. So being mindful of the fabrics that you choose as well, light cottons and linens as opposed to wool or anything like that. And also thinking about colors when it comes particularly to suits. Lighter colors are going to attract less heat from the sun, but they also, if you happen to have some sweaty groomsmen, they tend to show those sweat stains more. So just be mindful of colors and the effect that sweat has on different colors. And that applies to dresses as well. Lighter colored dresses will often show sweat stains. And so it's not a glamorous thing to think about, but you don't want to be the bridesmaid who has the pit stains at the wedding because you're wearing a light colored dress and it is really, really hot outside. So be mindful of that when you're choosing wedding party attire. And then on the day, think about things that will help to keep your wedding party comfortable. So packing a cooler of water in the limo as you go for photos, providing those atomizers so they can mist. Maybe you want to have little battery powered fans that you actually stick underneath the head table. If you've got a floor length linen on your head table, I have absolutely had women, bridesmaids hiking up their dresses underneath that table, giving their legs a little spritz with water, and then putting on a battery powered fan. That will do an awful lot to cool you down quickly. Thinking about things like the effects of the sun. So absolutely making sure that your wedding party, if you're doing photos or your ceremony outside, that they have sunscreen on. If there are people going golfing in the morning, make sure they have sunscreen on their faces. Otherwise, you get the sunburn line of the sunglasses. So watch out for that. Make sure that anyone who has a strapless dress on has their shoulders and their back protected. Talk to your makeup artist as well about the effects of sunscreen and makeup, because some sunscreens can cause like abnormal sort of flashback effects with your photography under your makeup. So I am not the expert on that one, but your makeup artist is. So please make sure you talk to your makeup artist about that. And just try and schedule that day. Like I said before, talk to your photographer, talk to your videographer, schedule the day so that you're taking advantage of the shade of the later afternoon when it's maybe not so hot, and try to ensure ultimately that everyone is able to enjoy your day, even if it does happen to be a scorcher, and that if it happens to be an abnormally cool or rainy day, that you have a really solid backup plan in place and someone set to implement it for you. Thank you, as always, for joining me here. If you have questions, if you're catching me on the replay, like I mentioned before, plug them into the comments. Don't hesitate to reach out. I'm Amy at unmistakably.you.com if you're sending me an email. And I just want to give you one last plug for our upcoming workshop. We have a series of workshops that we're doing every spring, actually. And upcoming, we have a workshop for anyone who perhaps isn't working with a formal professional day of coordinator, but needs to find a way to set up their itinerary for success, and perhaps even to hand over the organization of the day to a cousin or a friend who is willing to help out. So if you can't work with a day of coordinator, but you are assigning someone to make sure that that day flows smoothly, this is the workshop for you. You can sign up for that at unmistakably.com/workshops. We would love to see you there. We do still have a few seats remaining, so head on over. That happens on the 20th, so in just a few days. I hope to see you there. If not, I hope to see you back here next week, Wednesday at 8 p.m. We'll be talking about what to think about for your fall wedding. And as always, I encourage you, if you have something that you're wondering about that you'd like us to talk about here on an upcoming Wednesday night live, please don't hesitate to reach out and let me know. I always love to know what's on your mind so that I can help you as best I can. Have a great night, and I will catch you soon. Happy planning.